The arrival the great academy of the galactic conquered stood like a shining monument above the clouds of a world far removed from danger. It was a place where the young from dozens of different species gathered to study, train, and prepare for futures of leadership. To many of these students, life was gentle and ordered. Their home planets were lush gardens or calm seas where hardship rarely touched them. They had come to believe that strength and struggle belonged only to old legends, not to the halls where they now walked. That changed on the day a human arrived. Word spread quickly through the corridors before the official announcement. The new student was from Earth, a world classified in hushed tones as a death world, a place so harsh that every living thing had to fight every day to survive. Most alien students had read about it in their shared history texts, and many dismissed the accounts as exaggerated stories meant to frighten the young. But when the name was spoken aloud in the academy courtyard, silence swept across the gathered crowd. The thought of sharing lessons with a Deathworlder filled them with unease. When the time came for physical training in the academy's great gymnasium, the air was heavy with anticipation. Alien students filled the vast chamber, their bodies glowing with bioluminescent markings or cloaked in scales and feathers. They whispered to each other, eyes darting toward the entrance, wondering if the rumors were true. The gym was not merely a place of exercise, but a grand arena designed to test the coordination and stamina of students from many different worlds. Instructors used it to encourage teamwork, discipline, and fairness. On this day, fairness was the last thing on their minds. The door opened and the human stepped inside. He was not the monstrous figure many had imagined. No great fangs or claws, only a tall frame wrapped in the academy's simple uniform. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and his eyes scanned the room with quiet focus. Yet the moment those eyes met theirs, many students felt a shiver run through them, for there was a fire in that gaze that they could not explain. The instructor, a four-armed Zelth named Kravik, raised his voice and introduced the new arrival. "Students, this is Daniel Carter of Earth. He has been admitted to the academy as part of our exchange program. He will be joining you in all classes, including physical training." Kravik's tone was steady, but even he studied the human with a kind of guarded respect. Daniel gave a small nod, his expression calm, yet he could feel the weight of the stairs pressing down on him. He had expected suspicion, perhaps even hostility. He had grown up hearing how humanity's reputation had spread beyond the stars, how stories of their resilience and unpredictability unsettled others. Still, standing in that gym full of alien eyes made his heart beat faster, not with fear but with determination to prove himself. The whispers among the alien students grew louder. A slender Sarathi with shimmering green scales leaned toward her companion and hissed, "He looks ordinary, yet he comes from a world where even the plants can kill." A hulking Ovarn flexed his thick arms and muttered, "If the stories are true, he should not be allowed here. This is reckless." Others stayed silent, trying not to meet the human's gaze. Kravik clapped his four hands together, silencing the murmurs. "Today we will run a basic warm-up. Stretching, running, simple lifts. Nothing more." His eyes moved across the crowd. "And I expect discipline from all of you." His last words carried extra weight, as if aimed directly at those who were already planning to test the human. The group began to move through the first stretches, and Daniel followed along. His movements were fluid and steady, learned from years of training back on Earth where survival meant pushing the body against limits. Around him, the alien students bent and strained, some wobbling as the stretches demanded more of them than usual. Daniel barely broke a sweat, his body built for the constant pressures of gravity, storms, and struggle. He noticed the quick glances, the nervous looks, and realized that even these small movements were setting him apart. As the warm-up continued, tension thickened in the air. Students whispered that perhaps the stories were true after all. Some laughed nervously, saying it was only the first exercise and the human would surely falter later. But beneath their laughter was the quiet thrum of unease. Daniel kept his focus, not boasting or showing off, simply following the rhythm of the class. Yet every step and stretch drew more attention, and every breath he took seemed to echo louder in the silence of their doubts. By the end of the session's opening, one truth had begun to take root among the alien students. This human was different, and his presence would change everything. They did not yet know how, but fear had already begun to coil around their hearts. The first class. The next day, the alien students arrived early for physical training. Their curiosity sharpened into nervous anticipation. They gathered in small groups across the wide floor of the academy gymnasium, speaking in low tones about the human who had joined them. Some of them carried prideful looks as if determined to prove that their species could match whatever strength a Deathworlder possessed, while others avoided eye contact, still unsettled by his presence. The heavy doors opened, and Daniel Carter entered once again, dressed in the same simple uniform that looked plain against the bright scales, feathers, and shimmering hides of his classmates. He walked with calm steps, not rushing, his face unreadable. The chatter in the hall dropped at once, and every eye turned toward him. Instructor Kravik clapped his forehands, his voice echoing through the chamber as he announced the routine. Today would be more demanding than simple stretching. The class would break into pairs for warm-up exercises, holding positions, balancing, and controlled lifts. Kravik emphasized teamwork, reminding them that strength was not only about power, but about trust and cooperation. Yet his words felt thin as the students eyed Daniel with suspicion. No one wanted to be paired with him, and silence spread until Kravik himself assigned partners. Daniel was paired with a small but proud Sarathi named Sira. Her scaled body shimmered in hues of green and gold, and though she was agile and known for her speed, she clearly disliked the match. She stood stiff, her eyes flickering with unease as Daniel approached. He offered her a calm nod, and together they began the first drills. The exercises demanded balance and flexibility, with one partner providing resistance while the other pushed or leaned. For Daniel, these movements came naturally, and he held his strength in check so as not to overwhelm Sira. Even so, she felt as if she were pressing against a wall of stone. She strained, her limbs trembling while Daniel barely shifted his stance. The other students watched in silence, and some began whispering that the human was hiding his true strength. When the drill ended, Sira pulled away quickly, her pride wounded. Daniel noticed her breathing hard and gave her a small word of encouragement, telling her she had good balance. The kindness unsettled her even more because it felt like pity, though his tone carried no insult. The session moved on to running laps across the length of the gym. The floor shimmered as hovering platforms shifted to create obstacles, forcing the students to leap, climb, and weave through gaps. It was designed to test agility and endurance across species with very different bodies. The whistle blew, and the class charged forward. Alien students sprang across platforms, some darting swiftly, others lumbering with heavy steps. At first, Daniel kept a steady pace among them, not rushing to the front. But as minutes stretched into more, he noticed how quickly the others tired. Their movements slowed, their breathing turned ragged, and sweat gleamed across scales and feathers. Daniel's steps remained even, his breathing steady, his muscles working with practiced rhythm. One by one, his classmates began to falter. Some stumbled, others stopped completely, bending over in exhaustion. Daniel continued without strain, his eyes forward, his body driven by years of training in Earth's unforgiving conditions. Whispers grew from the sidelines where other students watched. They muttered that it was unnatural for a human to move so tirelessly. Some suggested he was enhanced by hidden technology, others that Deathworlders simply possessed unnatural stamina. Fear mixed with awe, and even the most skeptical students began to reconsider the stories they had dismissed as myths. By the time the whistle blew to end the run, Daniel was still running at full speed, his steps sure and strong. He slowed only when instructed, his breathing calm. Around him, his classmates lay sprawled across the floor, their bodies heaving, their limbs heavy. The difference was impossible to ignore. Kravik studied the human closely, his expression unreadable, but his sharp eyes flickered with something like approval. He raised his arms and addressed the class, telling them that what they had witnessed was the product of adaptation, not magic. On Earth, he reminded them, survival demanded endurance beyond what most species ever faced. He spoke with a teacher's authority, yet many students still stared at Daniel with unease. Daniel himself said nothing. He simply moved aside and waited for the next command, his mind calm but aware of the growing tension around him. He knew this was only the beginning, that every session would bring new tests, not only of his strength but of how the others would accept or reject him. That day ended with more whispers than ever before. Some students walked away shaking their heads in disbelief. Others avoided looking at him at all, but all carried the same realization. The Deathworlder was not only real but stronger than they had ever imagined. tests of endurance. The following week, the Academy Gymnasium was filled to the edges, not only with students of the class but with others who had come to watch. Rumors of the human's performance had spread like wildfire through the halls. Stories twisted and grew with each telling, some claiming that Daniel could run for days without stopping, others that he could break solid metal with a single strike. The truth mattered less than the fear and curiosity that now followed him. When the class gathered for endurance trials, dozens of eyes were fixed on him, waiting to see what would unfold. Instructor Kravik stood at the center of the arena floor, his forearms raised for silence. He explained the task with a steady voice. The students would be tested on strength and stamina through climbing the vertical pillars that reached toward the vaulted ceiling, lifting weighted spheres designed for different species, and running the obstacle course that twisted like a maze across the training ground. Each trial was meant to push students to their limits, revealing not only who was strongest but who could endure hardship with discipline. The climbing trial began first. The pillars shimmered as energy fields activated, making their surfaces shift between smooth and rough. Students launched themselves upward, some using claws, some with suction pads, others with wings that allowed short bursts of lift. Daniel placed his hands against the surface and began to climb using only his grip and balance. His arms pulled steadily, his legs drove upward, his movements flowing with practiced rhythm. Around him, students slipped, their claws failing to find purchase or wings faltering under strain. Daniel kept rising without pause until he reached the top and pulled himself over, his breathing calm. Gasps echoed from below as the human stood high above them, not triumphant but steady, as though this climb had been no more than routine. Next came the weighted spheres. Each was heavy, filled with dense alloy calibrated for students of different body types. Kravik instructed them to lift, hold, and move the spheres across the marked field. Many struggled, grunting and stumbling under the load. Daniel stepped forward, picked one of the largest spheres, and lifted it with care. He did not rush, carrying it across the line with smooth steps, setting it down as though it were manageable rather than crushing. He did not boast or show off, yet the ease with which he completed the task struck his classmates like a thunderclap. The final test was the obstacle course, the true measure of stamina. The platform shifted, walls rose and fell, narrow beams extended across pits of simulated gravity traps. The whistle blew and the students surged forward, determination burning in their eyes. Daniel moved with them, his body steady, his focus sharp. The others began strong but soon faltered. The heat of the lights bore down. The traps pulled at their limbs, the constant climbing and leaping drained their energy. One by one they slowed, panting and stumbling, their bodies pushed beyond comfort. Daniel pressed onward, his pace unbroken. He moved across beams with balance, vaulted walls with fluid strength, and kept running as though the course were only a warm-up. His endurance seemed endless, his rhythm unshaken. By the time the whistle ended the challenge, Daniel was the only one still moving at full strength. The other students lay sprawled across the ground, gasping for air, some clutching their sides, others too exhausted to stand. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of his steady breathing. The gathered crowd of onlookers whispered among themselves in disbelief. Kravik's gaze lingered on the human with something close to pride, though his words remained neutral. He told the class that endurance was not born in comfort but in hardship, that only those who had faced true trials learned the strength to continue when others faltered. His eyes swept across the exhausted students, then settled briefly on Daniel, and without another word he dismissed the session. As the students rose and staggered toward the doors, whispers spread again. Some voices trembled with awe, others with envy, but all carried the same realization. The human was not simply another student. He was a being forged in conditions no one else could imagine. For some this was inspiring, for others it was terrifying, and for all it was undeniable. Daniel walked from the gym with calm steps. His face quiet, but within he felt the weight of isolation pressing more heavily. Strength had set him apart, and though he had proven himself, he wondered if the others would ever see him as more than the death worlder who could not be broken. Confrontation. The academy could no longer pretend that the human was just another student. By now the halls rang with stories of his strength, his endurance, and his calm way of completing every challenge. Some students admired him quietly. Others whispered warnings, but many grew restless. Prideful voices among the older classes claimed that allowing a death worlder to stand above them was an insult. In their minds, Daniel's success was not a sign of discipline, but of danger. And sooner or later, someone would have to put him in his place. It was during a training session in the gym that the tension finally cracked. The lesson was meant to be about coordination in pairs, simple duels with padded weapons designed to test reflexes rather than cause harm. Instructor Kravik divided the students into groups, but before Daniel could be assigned a partner, a tall figure stepped forward. It was Ver, a noble-born student of the Karathi, known for his towering frame and hardened scales that gleamed like polished armor. He raised his weapon and declared loudly that he would face the human. The room fell silent. Kravik studied him with narrowed eyes and reminded him that this was not about pride but about training. Yet Ver insisted, his voice booming across the chamber, accusing the Academy of weakness for letting a Deathworlder overshadow them. He pointed at Daniel and demanded proof that humans were not as dangerous as the stories said. The instructor hesitated, knowing that denying the challenge might only fuel resentment. Finally, he allowed it, warning both students that the weapons were meant for skill and control, not injury. Daniel stepped forward calmly, his expression unreadable. He had expected this moment. Ever since the whispers began, he knew someone would challenge him openly. He accepted the padded weapon, holding it lightly in his hands, and nodded once to show he was ready. The duel began with a sharp sound from Kravik. Ver charged like a thunderbolt, his heavy frame pounding the floor, his weapon swinging with raw power. Daniel sidestepped the first blow, his body moving with speed born from years of training in environments where hesitation meant death. He tapped his opponent's side with a quick strike, controlled and precise, yet Ver roared in frustration. The alien swung again, harder this time, but Daniel flowed around him, deflecting and moving without aggression. To the watching students, it looked less like a fight and more like a storm breaking against an unshakable wall. The clash continued, Ver growing angrier with each missed strike, Daniel holding his strength back with deliberate restraint. He refused to unleash the full power that could end the match in a heartbeat, instead choosing to show skill and control. The crowd of students whispered in awe, some gripping their arms in nervous tension. They saw not only the human's speed and balance, but his refusal to humiliate or destroy his opponent. This restraint unsettled them more than raw strength ever could. At last, Ver stumbled, his weapon striking nothing but air, his chest heaving with effort. Daniel could have ended the duel at any moment, but instead he stepped back and lowered his weapon. His voice carried across the chamber, calm and steady, telling Ver that he had fought with courage and strength. But there was no honor in seeking to break someone only to feed pride. Those words cut deeper than any strike, for they stripped away the image of dominance Ver had tried to create. Kravik ended the duel before Ver could speak again. He declared the match complete and reminded the class that true strength was not shown by overpowering others, but by knowing when to stop. The lesson hung heavy in the air, for every student there had seen what Daniel could do and what he chose not to do. As the class ended, some students looked at the human with new respect, while others turned away with bitterness, unwilling to accept what they had witnessed. For Daniel, it was another test passed, but he knew the challenge was far from over. His presence had stirred emotions too deep to fade, and what came next would decide whether fear hardened into hatred or gave way to understanding. The lesson in fear, the duel with Ver, became the talk of the academy. Students replayed it in their minds, and in their retellings they magnified every detail, some swearing that Daniel moved faster than the eye could follow, others claiming he could have shattered Ver's armor like scales with a single real strike. What none of them could deny was the truth they had all seen. Daniel had held back. He had shown power without unleashing destruction, and that frightened them more than anything. For the first time, many of the alien students began to understand what it meant to live beside a Deathworlder. It was not only the raw strength, the endurance, or the skill. It was the knowledge that he possessed all of it and yet restrained himself. The idea that a being could control such danger unsettled them in ways they could not explain. Some respected him for it, but others whispered that this control was even more terrifying than recklessness, for it meant that he always carried the choice of unleashing something unstoppable. Instructor Kravik addressed the class the following day with stern words. He told them that fear was natural but misplaced, that Daniel was not their enemy and had shown them the very lesson the academy tried to teach. True strength is not found in domination but in responsibility. Many nodded, but few were convinced. Fear is stubborn, and pride even more so. During training, Daniel was asked to demonstrate lifting, balance, and restraint drills in front of the class. He did each exercise with care, never using more force than required, always ensuring his partner was safe. Some students saw this as kindness, others saw it as proof that he was holding back a storm. One small group of younger students, curious rather than afraid, began to follow him with questions. They asked about Earth, about its storms, its predators, its forests filled with dangers. Daniel answered honestly, telling them how his people grew strong not because they wished to, but because they had to. He spoke of how even in peace humans pushed their limits, running farther, climbing higher, not because the world demanded it, but because their hearts did. The younger students listened with wide eyes, and for the first time curiosity began to edge out fear. Yet among the older students, resentment still burned. Fair had been humiliated in front of everyone, and though Daniel had shown mercy, the noble-born warrior could not see it that way. Pride demanded that he find another chance to prove himself, and he whispered to others that the human's restraint was nothing but arrogance, a way to mock them. Some listened and nodded, feeding on their own jealousy. One evening after training, Daniel walked alone through the courtyard, the setting sun painting the sky in strange colors. He felt eyes on him, and when he turned he found Vare waiting, flanked by several supporters. They blocked his path and demanded another test, this time without the safety of padded weapons. Daniel stood silently, his gaze steady. He could see the anger burning in them, but he also saw fear hiding beneath it. He told them calmly that he would not fight outside the gym, that strength without discipline was nothing but chaos. His refusal only deepened their frustration, yet they did not press further, for even their pride could not overcome the unspoken truth that facing him in earnest could end badly. They left with curses and mutters, their footsteps fading into the shadows. Daniel continued his walk, his mind heavy. He had not come to the academy to be feared or worshipped. He had come to learn, to stand beside others, to prove that humans were not monsters but equals. Yet every act of restraint seemed to deepen the mystery around him. He wondered if the day would come when he would be forced to show them the full truth of what a Deathworlder could do. And he dreaded that moment more than any challenge. For the alien students who watched from afar, the lesson of fear lingered. They realized that the human's danger was not in what he did, but in what he chose not to do. And in that choice lay a kind of strength they could neither deny nor fully accept. Breaking the barrier, the whispers about the human no longer belonged only to the students. By the end of the week, the professors and senior instructors were meeting in private chambers, their voices tense as they debated what it meant to have a Deathworlder training among their youth. Some argued that it was reckless to allow such a being to remain, pointing to the long list of species who had once fought wars out of fear. Others insisted that the Academy's purpose was to unite the galaxy, not divide it, and that removing Daniel would betray everything they stood for. In the end, the decision was made to continue the program, but the conversations reached the ears of the students and stirred the tension even further. In the gym, the air had grown sharper. Every class began with wary stares, and even simple exercises became tests of comparison. Where once they had competed against one another with cheerful rivalry, now every alien measured themselves against the human, and the outcome was always the same. No one could match his endurance, no one could match his balance, no one could outlast him. Some began to avoid training altogether, inventing excuses to escape the shame of falling short. Others grew resentful, whispering that the Academy was no longer a place of equals but a stage for one Deathworlder. Daniel felt the distance widening around him. He still trained with quiet focus, never boasting, never showing aggression, yet the gap could not be hidden. He saw it in the way groups huddled when he entered, the way laughter died when he passed. He told himself he had faced worse back on Earth, that isolation was not new, but the weight pressed heavier here because he had come to prove something not only for himself, but for his people. If the Academy rejected him, then it would reject the idea of humans as allies. Among the students, the younger ones remained the most curious. They followed him after classes, asking about Earth's storms, about the predators that roamed its forests, about the oceans that could swallow whole cities. He answered patiently, his words painting pictures of a world harsh but beautiful. They began to see him less as a monster and more as a guide, someone who carried stories of survival that inspired rather than frightened. Their voices spread quietly, softening the fear in corners where curiosity was stronger than pride. The breaking point came during a large group exercise designed to test teamwork. Students were divided into squads and sent into a simulated environment where they had to cross shifting platforms, avoid collapsing traps, and carry heavy markers to the finish. Daniel was placed with a group of aliens who had never spoken to him before, their faces tight with unease. At first they tried to work without him, barking instructions to each other and keeping him at a distance. When the platforms began to fall faster than expected, their plan collapsed. One of them, a slim Alari with fragile wings, lost his footing and fell toward a pit that shimmered with simulated gravity. Without hesitation, Daniel dove after him, his hand closing around the alien's arm and pulling him back with a single powerful motion. The group stared in silence as he set the Alari down gently and told him to breathe. Something shifted in that moment. They could no longer deny that the strength they feared was also a shield that could protect them. They allowed him into their formation, and with his guidance the group moved more smoothly. He did not take command but pointed out safe paths, offered his back as support, and carried the heaviest loads without complaint. By the time they reached the finish, they were exhausted but alive, and for the first time the aliens looked at him not with suspicion, but with gratitude. Word of the event spread quickly. Students who had once avoided him now whispered that perhaps the human was not only dangerous but trustworthy. Respect began to replace fear, slowly and unevenly but unmistakably. Even Vare, though still bitter, could not ignore the way others looked at Daniel now. The barrier of fear had cracked, and through that crack something new was growing. The possibility that the Deathworlder was not an enemy or a rival, but an ally whose presence could change them all. Respect earned, the Academy's final test of the season was unlike any ordinary class. It was called the Survival Challenge, a simulation designed to place squads of students in a harsh environment where teamwork and resilience were measured above all else. Every year it pushed students to the edge of their endurance, forcing them to depend on one another in order to succeed. For many it was the most dreaded day of training, but for Daniel it was the day he had been waiting for. He knew this was his chance to show them not only what a human could endure, but why that strength existed, not for conquest but for survival and protection. The squads gathered at the edge of the simulation chamber, a vast space that could shift into different terrains through advanced projectors and energy fields. The instructors announced that this year's challenge would be a hostile landscape filled with collapsing structures, shifting ground, and sudden storms. The students listened with tense faces, aware that every step could bring danger. Daniel was placed with a mixed squad that included Sira the Sarathi, the slim Alari he had once saved, and 2 Ovarn brothers who had previously avoided him. Their eyes lingered on him with uncertainty, but they no longer turned away as before. When the simulation began, the landscape transformed into a jagged canyon filled with crumbling ledges and sudden gusts of wind. The squad moved cautiously, but the first collapse came quickly. A platform gave way beneath one of the Ovarn brothers, sending him sliding toward the edge. Daniel reacted before anyone else, grabbing the heavy student and pulling him back with sheer force. The Ovarn looked at him in stunned silence before nodding in quiet thanks. The others saw this and began to follow Daniel's steady movements, trusting his instincts as he guided them across the treacherous ground. The further they went, the more dangerous the course became. A sudden storm swept through the canyon, lightning flashing across the sky as strong winds threatened to tear the students from their path. The Ilari's wings caught the wind and nearly carried him into the void, but Daniel caught him again, anchoring him to the ground. He shielded the smaller alien with his own body, taking the brunt of the storm until they could move forward. The others formed around them, realizing that his strength was not a threat to them but the reason they could continue. At the halfway point, they encountered a collapsing bridge over a wide chasm. The markers they had to carry were heavy, and the bridge shook with every step. Fear rippled through the group, but Daniel took the lead, crossing first with the largest load. His balance never faltered, his step steady, and with his guidance the rest followed one by one. Even when the final section of the bridge began to crumble, he extended his arm and pulled Sira across to safety. She looked at him with wide eyes, her earlier mistrust replaced by something closer to respect. By the end of the challenge, the squad was exhausted, their limbs heavy, their breathing ragged. Yet every one of them reached the finish because Daniel had carried the heaviest burdens, steadied the weakest steps, and faced the greatest risks without hesitation. When the simulation ended and the canyon faded back into the smooth floor of the chamber, silence filled the air. Then the applause began, not from his squad alone, but from other students who had witnessed his actions. The sound grew until the chamber echoed with it, a thunder of recognition that swept across the academy. Instructor Kravik stepped forward, his voice carrying authority, but also pride. He declared that Daniel had not only passed the challenge, but had shown the essence of what the academy stood for. He reminded them all that strength without restraint is dangerous, but strength used for the sake of others is what creates leaders and allies. His words cut through the air, and the students knew they had witnessed something that would not be forgotten. Daniel stood among them quietly, not smiling, not boasting. He felt relief more than triumph. For the first time since arriving, he was not alone. The students looked at him not as the Death Worlder to be feared, but as a comrade who had proven his place among them. Some approached to thank him, others gave silent nods of acknowledgement, but all carried the same truth in their eyes. The barrier of fear had broken. Respect had taken its place. And as Daniel left the chamber that day, he knew that the academy had changed. Perhaps the galaxy itself would change too, for the lesson learned in that gym was greater than endurance or strength. It was the lesson that even the most dangerous of beings could choose to protect rather than destroy. And in that choice lay the hope of unity. The Death Worlder's legacy weeks passed after the survival challenge, and the Academy no longer looked at Daniel Carter with suspicion. Where once the whispers had followed him like shadows, now quiet respect filled the halls. The alien students who had once avoided his gaze now nodded when they passed, some even stopping to exchange words. The younger ones still asked about Earth, hungry to hear stories of a place so wild that it forged a people who could endure anything. Daniel told them not only of storms and predators, but also of human kindness, of how his people built families and friendships in the middle of hardship, of how they laughed even when the skies threatened to break them. The older students, too proud to admit their fear, found themselves remembering the day he saved their classmates. They could not forget how he had carried burdens no one else could lift, or how he had shielded others with his own strength. Pride was slow to give way, but slowly even they began to see that what they had mistaken for arrogance had only been discipline and restraint. Some approached him cautiously to train alongside him, testing themselves against his endurance. Though they failed to match him, they left with a sense that they had learned something far more valuable than victory. Instructor Kravik spoke often of the lesson Daniel had given them. He reminded the students that the galaxy feared Death Worlders because of their strength, but that fear blinded them to the truth. A being who possessed such power and still chose to protect others carried a responsibility greater than any weapon. That lesson spread beyond the gym, whispered through the academy, then carried to the professors, and eventually reaching the conquered leaders who had questioned the wisdom of admitting a human. Daniel remained quiet, never seeking the attention that now followed him. He trained each day with the same steady determination, never flaunting his victories, never mocking the ones who could not keep up. His presence began to change the way the academy thought about strength itself. No longer did they see it as the ability to crush rivals, but as the will to endure for the sake of others. Students who once competed only for glory now began to measure themselves by how well they supported their squad mates. The greatest change came during the closing ceremony of the season. The academy gathered in the great hall where banners of every species hung in shimmering colors. One by one, the squads were honored for their performance. When Daniel's name was spoken, the hall rose to its feet. The applause was not for fear nor for spectacle, but for respect freely given. For the first time since stepping into the academy, Daniel felt truly accepted. He raised his hand, not to bask in the moment, but to remind them of what he had tried to show all along. He told them that humans did not survive Earth because they were stronger than its storms or deadlier than its predators. They survived because they stood together, because they chose to protect one another. His voice carried across the hall, simple and steady, and the silence that followed was filled with understanding. From that day, the academy remembered the year the human joined their gym class not as a tale of fear, but as the beginning of respect. And in the years that followed, when alliances were tested and the galaxy faced threats that no single species could endure alone, many would remember that lesson. The Death Worlder had come not to terrify but to teach, and his presence left a legacy that would shape generations. The end.